So we can take our time to dig in the, dig in the 3 steps that Sarah's mentioned. So there's 3 mandatory components of due diligence, which are first, access to information, second, risk assessment, and third, risk mitigation if needed, which are, as we said already, steps that can happen like either simultaneously, or there can be some level of back and forth between those 3 steps. So it's very rare that you'll have a case where you do access to information, move on to risk assessment, move on to risk mitigation, and be done with it. So keep that in mind throughout the presentation. We're going to split them and present them one by one for the sake of the presentation, but do keep in mind that there's some level of back and forth. And finally, we're going to say a few words on the role of certification within the UTR, UKTR due diligence process. It's going to be a very general introduction. We will mention it at a later stage, but we are planning an extra 3-hour session in several languages just on this question, because there's a lot of requests and a lot of clarification to provide on that. So we'll have a few slides today, but if you're interested, we'll have a more in-depth session later coming up.
Chloe, can I just jump in and see that we don't see you?
You don't see me?
No.
Yeah, I thought I'd turn that on. How about
there
now?
You are. Perfect.
Yes, hello everyone. Sorry for this. Okay, and so you see the slide, you see me, and you hear me. So everything's fine now, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's first see what is behind accessing information. Well, the first thing to keep in mind is the type of information that needs to be gathered, and that's absolutely mandatory. Okay, so this is the list of all the information that shall always be known and documented according to the regulation. So the first few bullet points, they're relatively easy for any business to collect. They're usually things that company will have data on regardless of the regulation, right? So the description of the product that is placed on the market, the quantity of material that is placed on the market, the identity of the direct supplier, so tier 1 supplier, and the identity of the buyers, unless they are final consumers, right? So those elements are mandatory, but that should be relatively easy compared to the following elements, which are information on species, so scientific name can be required, and information on the origin of the timber, which means the country of harvest at the very minimum. And we'll see in a bit that identifying the region and concession of origin can be also required. But the bare minimum is to identify all the countries of harvest of the timber, right? So those 2 elements might be a bit more challenging. And then in red, you'll see that the regulation says that operators also must collect documents or other information indicating legal compliance. And this bullet point is quite less clear, right? It will vary, it will change on a case-by-case basis, and that's something that the operator will need to establish. Why is that so? Well, the applicable legislation is not the same depending on the country of harvest, and the degree of enforcement of this legislation is also not the same everywhere. So the extent of this additional information collection requirement will depend both on the legislation in place and the level of risk existing in the country regarding the application of this legislation, right? So it's important to keep in mind that the objective of document collection, of this specific document collection, is to identify if and where there are risks of legal violations, to potentially mitigate identified risk, and to finally be able to conclude low risk of legal violation. So the approach of asking how much information is needed and do I have enough documents in my hands is kind of the wrong approach and the wrong question. Document collection is not an end in itself, right? It's it's not very useful to have a lot of documents if you have no idea what they mean, what they're here for, and what's their connection to timber legality. So collecting and requiring a document to suppliers must serve the purpose of risk assessment and potentially risk mitigation. So the better approach is to ask ourselves, which information and documents do you need? Which documents are relevant for you? And to do that, you need to ask yourself, what does an information or document tell you about your timber? What's the purpose of a specific document, and how a specific document or information will evidence compliance with forest-related legislation in place? All right. Supply chain mapping is not as such a requirement. The regulation is not saying operators must do supply chain mapping. However, since they have to identify at the minimum the country of origin of harvest of the timber, that is a very good starting point to reach this requirement, right? So doing supply chain mapping, identifying all the entities along the supply chain is a good way to understand the product, understand the supply chain, identify the country of harvest, if necessary, the region and forest of harvest. And collecting documents about this supply chain, such as invoices, so sales or transport document, let's say broadly, can be important as an evidence of the commercial links between the entities in your supply chain map. So it's important to keep in mind that document collection can serve the purpose of proving and highlighting your degree of confidence in the country of harvest of your timber, which is a mandatory information and which is also an information you need to properly do risk assessment, right? So asking for trade and transport documents, it might not be directly linked to a risk of illegality. It might be necessary to confirm a supply chain map to comply with the regulation requirements. Other information can be gathered while doing this exercise of supply chain mapping. So, of course, the entities, who is involved in the supply chain, but also who is doing what, so different industrial processes in play, the different components of the final products, when and how do they come together, which species come together, and if there's physical routes that might be different than the ownership route, let's say, of the product. Certification claims also can vary and be different at different stages of the supply chain. So as you see here, this is a quite simplified supply chain map where we have only 3 forests, 2 sawmill, 1 factory, and then up to the final consumer. In reality, supply chain mapping can sometimes look like this, so way more tentacular. And so that's why it's important to have good tools to do this exercise, because it can get cumbersome pretty quickly when you have complex material, right? So that's just to give you an idea. There are several ways of doing supply chain mapping in order to comply with regulation requirements. You can have fancy diagram like this. You can also take your pen and paper. That's usually what I do all the time as a first step. Those are old tools, but they're quite efficient. Or you can also use Excel tables, for instance. We have a supply chain mapping tool which is freely available for everyone. So it's basically just an Excel template that you can twist and adjust according to your needs. And I know there's also IT tools which are dedicated to do supply chain mapping. So really there's no one way to do that, but you'll have to find the best for you, what suits you best and suits your needs. Okay, so now we have covered what is required. Let's stop and say and talk a little bit about the quality of the information that operators have to gather. So it's about asking ourselves about information integrity, right? So not only do we have to collect this information, but we also have to raise key questions in order to have confidence in this information and documents that we collect. So the first point is about the level of trust that we have and the level of evidence that we want. Second point is about having keeping in mind the validity, to check the validity of documents and keep an eye open for fraud on documents. The third point would be asking ourselves whether all the information I have is related. And the fourth point is about corruption. So let me go into a little bit of detail. Trustworthiness and level of evidence. The idea here is to ask that operators ask themselves how much concrete evidence do they need to back up the information that they gather. So information on species and countries of harvest, for instance. You might have a good level of, in some instance, a very good level of confidence about the country of harvest. It might be the case that you don't need a ton of documents to prove that it is indeed coming from this country of harvest. If all the information you have is coherent and you have a good level of trust and you can justify it, that might be enough. On the other hand, in some instances, you might want to have several pieces of hard evidence to support your information collection about species or countries of harvest, right? So in riskier countries, for instance, a riskier supply chain profile, you might want to request several documents to cross-check the information and make sure that all the documents contain the same information. You might also want to diversify the sources of information in case where you don't have initially a good level of trust in the information that is given to you on your supply chains, right? I'm going to briefly mention timber testing. It is a way of mitigating risks. So I'm going to talk about it in the third part, but it's also a way of cross-checking information on species and regions of harvest. So just keep in mind that that's a way of diversifying the sources of information. That's a tool that's out there. There are several different timber tests that are available, but keep in mind that basically they're here and they're allowing to confirm a declared species or a declared origin, right? Diversifying sources of information, so there's timber testing, but it can also be not only relying about documents sent by the supplier, but it can also be opening up to other sources of information, such as expert inputs, stakeholders' inputs, various reports from organizations such as NGOs, but also governmental reports, statistical reports, etc. And also realizing direct observations, right? So basically the idea is that all the information that is collected by an operator, it must have a certain level of trustworthiness and evidence. Secondly, it's also important to check the validity of the information that is provided. So we're aware that it's very difficult to have 100% confidence in 100% of the documents that are collected, right? So this is more about keeping an eye open and keeping a level of attention about things that might be off. So checking that documents are properly signed and stamped can be a very good way to do that. Checking the dates of emissions of documents, also checking that the template used, the format of the document is appropriate and is the same that's regularly used. So those are a few elements that can be should be taken into account. And finally, some of the documents can also be checked against online databases that are available for everyone. Now, this is not the case for all the documents related to forestry. So sadly, this is not something you can do 100% of the time, but this is something that is sometimes available. I know that China has a database to check invoices. I know that some countries, I believe Australia, has a database to check export documents. And there's a few other examples. So use those tools whenever they're available. Know that it's not the case all the time, but that can be, when they are there, do use them. Visual observation on documents is also something that that should be kept in mind. Of course, people can modify documents in a way that you won't be able to see it, but sometimes operators can also be provided with documents where it's very obvious that something was changed in the document. So I hope it's big enough for you. Those documents where it's quite obvious that some fields have been blanked out and information there has been replaced, right? So that's something that should raise an alarm when you're looking at and raise questions about the validity of those documents, and therefore whether you can trust it or not and use it or not. Another less obvious example, maybe you've seen it already. We use it a lot. We like it a lot. So this document is Chinese. Okay, fine. You might not understand what the fields mean, but do you see anything that seems off in this document? I will. So I have a poll for you, but I will leave this document just a little bit more because when I launch the poll, you won't be able to see it. So basically, the question is going to ask you whether you have seen what's wrong or where it could have been tampered with or not. I'm just going to leave it, 5 seconds. Okay, I hope I can launch the poll and you can tell us if you've seen anything weird in the document. Okay, I think I can close and share. I hope everyone who wanted to participate had the chance to. So 64% of you have seen what's wrong, and 31% are not sure. I hope I'm back to the presentation. Let me check. Yes, okay. So indeed, let me take this pointer. Yeah, okay. So it's quite subtle, but if you keep an eye open on the documents you're assessing, you should be able to see things like that. So here we can clearly see that the lines for the different fields, they're discontinued. They have like this little step here. And if you have very good eyes, you might be able to see that there's a square that's in a slightly different shade of beige or white. So once you see it, it's very obvious that some figures have been replaced. And so it's really clear that the document has been tampered with, right? So again, that would be a document for which we would really question its relevance and validity. Let me turn that off. How do I do that? No, it's still there. Okay, yeah. Good. So yeah, proper level of trust and evidence, checking the validity of document as much as possible. Checking the relatedness of documents is also something that's very important when doing the step of accessing information. So the idea here is again to keep an eye open for things that would be really off. So the idea is to verify that information tally across documents and that everything makes sense and everything is coherent, right? So the dates between the documents, if there's different steps, then it's good to check that the dates align, right? In terms of harvesting the timber, transporting the timber, transforming the timber. Volumes is the same, like it's not expected to do full volume reconciliation in all the cases, but however, it can be a good idea to check that if you're buying several hundreds of cubic meters of timber at the end of the supply chain, if you're provided information about a small forest just harvesting a few dozen of cubic meters every year, there might be a problem there, right? There's a obvious discrepancy between information. And it is the same for other things, such as species, qualities, dimension, trading entities, but basically any information that are in the document. It is good to have a general look at the whole document set and ask yourself if everything makes sense and if everything aligns. So that would be the point about relatedness. And finally, last but not least, the tough question of corruption. So it's true that when doing document collection, it is important to keep in mind that in some countries with a high level of corruption, it's easy to get any document without complying with the legislation. That's a very difficult thing to detect and prove. But well, ideally, it's more like gathering information on the level of corruption of a country will inform how much evidence you need, how much strict you're going to be, what is your level of attention on your supply chain, right? It's something that's gonna add on to your the level of information that you want and the level of trust you want to place on this information. That's again something to keep in mind. And that's it for the first step, the first part about collecting documents. Now you might ask, okay, we've mentioned that this extra documents to indicate compliance with legality, we've not really described it. Well, that's because you need to do a certain level of risk assessment, right? Once you have determined the country of harvest, you need to do a certain amount of risk assessment in order precisely to determine how much additional information and documents you will request to your supplier. That's where it gets a little bit circular. So let's go to the risk assessment step. What is the objective of this step? Well, first of all, to assess the information you have obtained. And more precisely, the idea is to identify systemic risks in the country of harvest. So we're going to look at the 5 legal categories that constitute relevant legislation according to the regulation, right? And on the basis of those 5 legal categories, we're going to assess whether systemic risks are applicable to the supply chain. So we are usually talking about country level risk because it's very common that legislation will be adopted and enforced at the country level, right? It can happen that it's not. For instance, if you're in a federal state, there might be some laws at the federal level or regional level. So whenever you hear me talking about country risk level, that's because I'm referring to the legislation level, right? So the idea here is to go from the more general to the more specific. So we have a legislation applying to a whole country. What is it? What's the likelihood that it's not properly enforced? Is it applicable to my supply chain? Going from the more general to the more detailed. That's the idea behind the risk assessment step. And finally, the last point would be to identify risk that unknown material is entering the supply chain. So in other words, the risk of mixing. Now, to do that, to facilitate this process, because it's quite heavy to look at the whole legislation of a country, we can first have a step of breaking it down into broad categories and having a look at the prevalence of illegalities and also cases where we don't have to apply due diligence and cases where we will not be able to mitigate risk. So that's a table that summarizes this whole process basically. So it's a lot of information, but I'm gonna walk you through each and every step. When we're looking at the origin, the regulation basically says that there are some instances where you're not going to be able to mitigate risk. So that's what we call conclusive risk factor. So you need to be able to identify this as a first step, as an entry step into due diligence, in the risk assessment step, sorry. So cases where the timber is under, or timber entity is under a UN or EU sanction, that's a no-go. Cases where the timber is fueling or potentially fueling an armed conflict, also a no-go. And that's more obvious, but the case where the timber is under a harvest or a trade ban, no-go. So those are conclusive risk factors which are all linked to the origin of the timber. Now we also have 2 kind of green lanes, so cases where the timber products are really exempted from due diligence, and that would be FLEGT license for the origin part and CITES license for the species part, right? However, once you've excluded all those green lanes or no-go scenarios, in any cases, operators must ask themselves, what is the legislation in place and what is the likelihood that it's not properly enforced, right? Keeping in mind that they can also start by identifying high-profile cases, which would be eye-catcher situations that would kind of raise a red flag and say, you need to be more careful. And I'm going to detail those cases for each of those broad categories. So let's start with species. Oh, I thought I had it pulled, but no. Okay, so first thing, which is a bit tricky, is that the scientific name is not an absolutely mandatory requirement of the regulation. But the trick is the regulation says it is mandatory where there can be confusion with the common name, which, truth be told, is kind of all the time. Like, it's very rare. It can happen sometimes that there's not a lot of confusion possible based on the common name. But in most scenarios, species can, like the common name can be confusing and can apply to different scientific species, or one scientific species will have different common names. So it's a best practice to request the scientific name as the rule of thumb, and make it an exception to be okay with common names, right? In any case, it is very important in the risk assessment process because it will help you first to find out information on the species through open database. So IUCN status, CITES status, etc. You cannot access information on species unless you have the full scientific name. Okay. It will also be important for you to verify the coherence of the information, as we mentioned, between the declared origin of the timber and the species, right? If you don't have the scientific name, it will be difficult to do the step of cross-checking information. And finally, specific species sometimes have different risks associated to them. So we have put here quite a common example where oak can cover different species with very different level of risks, right? So oak species can be at high risk of illegality, for instance, Quercus mongolica, and it can be at low risk of illegality, for instance, Quercus alba, which is growing in Canada and the USA. So they're growing in very different countries and they have very different risks of illegal harvesting attached to them. So in this case, knowing for oak, for sure, knowing the scientific name is a requirement. Okay, so that's a list of known and documented species that are known to be at risk of illegal logging. It's not an exhaustive list, but those are the species which are regularly finger pointed, let's say, for being illegally harvested. So Ipe from Brazil, Kevazingo from Gabon, rosewood from Madagascar, and Mongolian oak. And yes, that's just a few screenshots of reports, of public reports on those species. So just have a bit of water. A few words on the IUCN status. It's very important to keep in mind that the IUCN status is a scientific indication of the conservation status of biological species. So it's basically evaluating the risk of extinction, and it can grant several levels, let's say, which range from is concerned to extinct in the wild and extinct. In theory, an endangered species, even critically endangered, could be harvested and traded legally, right? It's not very connected. It's just like the degree of conservation and the fact that a species can be legally harvested and traded, they're different. However, it is a very important indication because it is more likely that an endangered species would be protected either by a national legislation in place, but maybe also by a management plan, a forest management plan in place, etc. So checking the IUCN status of the species does not mean that it's illegal to harvest and trade the species, but it must be a red flag that is raising the level of attention and care when there's an endangered status coming up. It must prompt further assessment of whether the species is indeed legally harvested and traded. Okay. I don't have a slide on CITES, but CITES, however, is a bit different. It's linked to the IUCN status, but it's not the exact same list, and it's more about the trade than the harvest. Okay. So keep those things in mind where assessing the risk of illegality on species. Trade and transport. Things to pay attention when thinking about trade and transport legality. Misclassification is a well-known way of avoiding to pay taxes or to conceal illegal harvesting. So that is one thing that is quite important to keep in mind, and paying attention to differences in the description of products on trade and transport documents is important because of that, because it can illustrate or it can reveal other illegalities happening, right? The illegality is not, can be in itself not putting proper information on documents, but it can also be a signal that something else is happening, such as not paying taxes or not enforcing other regulations on harvest, right? So paying attention to quantities, sizes, and species is important there. There's another thing about trade and transport, which is a bit more rare, but it's important to understand it and keep it in mind, and it's illegal transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is basically using international trade to avoid paying taxes on profit in the country of harvest, right? So the idea is that a company would artificially lower prices of export of the timber in order to lower the profit made in the country of harvest, and that can be illegal, right? So, and the consequence would be that they make like a sister company or something, some company they are associated to would make a high profit overseas, and potentially in a country which has a beneficial tax regime. So that's something that has been quite well documented for the Congo Basin countries, which do have quite a high profit taxes regime, but that's what's legal there, so that should be enforced. Yes, so that's the second thing to keep an eye on when thinking about trade and transport illegality. Then, moving on to origin. Well, first of all, let's talk a little bit about flexi license. So Indonesia is currently the only VPA country which has reached the stage of issuing flexi license, right? So right now, only timber coming from Indonesia can be covered by a flexi license. Other countries have been in the process of negotiating a voluntary partnership agreement with the EU, but they have not reached the stage of issuing flexi license, right? So the process is, so the idea is that for the EU TR, that product covered by flexi license would be exempt from due diligence, so they don't have to be included in this whole process of accessing information, risk assessment, etc. But there's still, the idea to keep in mind is that there's still a certain level of verification to do before concluding that this flexi license is applicable and is exempt, right? So making sure that it is from Indonesia and making sure that it is included in the scope of the VPA, and making sure that the license is valid. And that's exactly the same process for CITES, like CITES permits, sorry. So the idea beyond that is that CITES, I don't have a visual on that, but it's exactly the same process. So species covered by a CITES permit, they're exempt from due diligence, which means that the operator does not have to include this product in the whole process described in the due diligence procedures. However, you would still need to make sure that the CITES license is applicable and is valid, right? So there's still an element of verification ahead of concluding that you don't have to do more verification. I hope that's clear. So that's from the 2 exemptions. When we're talking about origin, it's also important to keep an eye on high-profile cases, right? So countries of origin of harvest which are known to be places where illegal harvesting is prevalent and is happening a lot. So here we just have a few screenshots of a few cases that are under the radar. Sorry. So I think we have Burma, Ukraine, Congo Basin, and Brazil. Yeah, it's being the main target and the main documented area where illegal harvesting can happen. Keeping an eye on corruption perception index can also be a good thing to do, just to weigh in the level of risk, the general level of risk associated to a country, right? Once you've done this few first step of picking up on red flags that should raise your concern and or exemption, that products that should not go into your due diligence system. Once you've completed this first step, it is not enough. It is still necessary to go more in depth and to further evaluate the risks of illegality based on the country of harvest. I would just like to give a brief reminder of what is a risk-based assessment to do that. So here you have the visual about what would be a conformance assessment. Conformance assessment would be asking yourself, for each entity of my supply chains, what are the rules, and doing a verification on all the rules, right? A risk-based approach is a bit different. It consists of asking yourself, what are the rules, then focusing only on the rules which you have identified as likely to be breached, as likely to be non-complied with, right? So a risk-based assessment has this kind of initial step of assessing which rules are likely not to be enforced, and those are the ones you will focus on. And so basically, let me go forward instead of backward. So basically, the idea would be for each country of harvest of timber placed on the market to ask the following questions. Are there specified risks present in the country of harvest of the timber? Again, it can be the state or the region, but usually it's the country. If yes, if there are specified risks, are they relevant to the supply chain, to my supply chain that I am assessing? And if yes, is there already something that can tell me it's mitigated or not? If not, I will need to do something about it, and I will need to do risk mitigation, right? Just to give you a more clear idea, to illustrate it, let's say with a fictive case, like a fictive case study. So let's say I'm an operator and I'm importing timber from plantations that are located in country X, right? I've done my research and I've identified 3 origin risks linked to timber harvesting in country X. The first risk of illegality is that timber is over-harvested in natural forests, right? So forest management units are regularly exceeding quotas and the state is not able to control this. And so this is an illegality that is systematic and that happens quite a lot. Well, in this case, I could say that, oh, okay, it's not applicable to my supply chain. It's applicable at the country level, but for natural forests. And I'm buying timber coming from plantations. So I can rule that out. Okay, there's a risk, but it's not applying to me. The second risk I've identified is that harvesting can be conducted without the annual harvest permit being delivered by forest authorities, right? It should not happen, but it does happen regularly. When in my fictive case, my supplier has already provided me its annual harvest permit, right? I do not require it, but they send it to me nonetheless. So I already have it. And I've done some assessment on the validity and the trustworthiness of this document. I think it's valid. It has stamps. Everything looks fine. So I have confidence in this document. I've already mitigated this risk, right? So it's where things can happen pretty fast. So this risk is already mitigated. I can leave it aside. The third risk that I've identified in my fictive example and fictive country is that mandatory social agreements with local communities are not signed prior to harvesting, and that's required by the regulation in place. This risk is applicable, and I have no elements in my hands to say that it's been mitigated or it's not applicable. So basically, this is where I will need to focus my attention, and I will need to address and mitigate this specific risk. That's just to give you an idea of the thought process behind assessing risk of illegality in a given country of harvest. Right? It's a very simplified case study, fictive case study, but that's kind of the thought process behind it. So I hope that's clear, this risk assessment part. Last but not least, supply chain complexity. So as Sarah mentioned already, the regulation is talking about supply chain complexity, but in reality, what is required is to assess whether the material could be mixed with a non-material and or illegally harvested traded material, right? A non-material could be illegally harvested and is not complying with the requirements to have information on the country of harvest or region of harvest or forest of harvest, depending on the cases, right? This risk, this risk of mixing should be assessed throughout the whole supply chain, right? So not only in the country of harvest of the timber. Basic ideas that should guide the assessment process is to ask ourselves whether all the material entering the products have been identified and accounted for. And also, if in case we have a suspicion that other undeclared input could be mixed in my supply chain, would it carry a different level of risk, right? Would it come from a completely different country, or would it be another smallholder that might be a neighbor to the smallholder that for which I have gathered documents that would have the exact same profile, right? So asking yourself also, basically trying to identify where and what material could be mixed to what you've already been assessing. Again, a little poll for which normally I've kind of already answered. So I hope it's running. I will keep that open some minute or something. So the question was, what should we take into account? And we have a really high amount of all tiers in the supply chain. And 28% of participants think that all processing unit in the supply chain can be taken into account. Well, this is where it was a bit of a trick, but even a trader which is taking physical possession of the material without doing any kind of transformation, they could mix products, right? If it's a trader that's trading sawn timber, for instance, well, they could mix sawn timber pretty easily. So yes, all tiers in the supply chain must be taken into account. Maybe the only exception would be an entity that is not taking physical possession of the material, because obviously if they are not taking physical possession, then they cannot really mix one product with another. Okay, but other than that, all the entities need to be considered. So the more you have, the more difficult it's going to be. Yeah. So basically, there's not a single way to do this exercise, which is quite complex and challenging. But a few factors can be taken into account to find the risk level, basically. So that explains why the regulation is talking about the complexity of the supply chain, because the longer the supply chain and the more complex, well, the higher the risk of mixing. It's the same for the nature of the product, right? The more components you have in a product, the higher the risk of mixing. And it's the same for composite materials. So composite materials such as pulp and paper, panels with wood fiber, they're usually quite complex because they will mix timber from various countries and various species, which is okay as long as you gather the information on those countries and species, right? Having a look at the segregation and traceability systems in place can be a good way to determine whether there's a risk that a factory, for instance, would tell you, I'm selling you timber from this country, but in reality could not tell one product from the other, and if it's all mixed in the transformation process. Big volume mismatch would also be something indicative of mixing, right? If again, same example as I just said, it's like if you're buying huge quantities of final products and the document package you're receiving is linking back to a small forest, harvesting small volumes, well, obviously it probably means that there are other sources of timber that you've not been provided information on, right? That still remain to be disclosed. So those are just a few pictures just to highlight the fact that small components in product are often overlooked, but technically they need to be assessed as the others. So even dowels, or maybe more important, it's like veneer. Veneer are very often overlooked because they're a very small part of the product, but they can be a very different origin and very different species than the rest of the product, such as the panel that is in the core of the product. It can also be the case that a company is mixing like a very small part, like 10% of the panel is coming from, let's say, tropical hardwood. That happens a lot. This 10% can come from the first transformation leftovers, right? So even if it is the case, they need to be identified and assessed because it's virgin fibers. So even if it's a small part of the product, even if it comes from leftovers from the first transformation, they still need to be identified, declared, and assessed, right? And to conclude, that's just a few pictures about various levels of segregation and traceability that can be applied in a company. So that's something that, that's also important to keep in mind in order to have a conclusion on the risk of mixing